Just as a backdrop in terms of public power, we really are a unique participant in the ERO. In some odd sense, we are not only representative of local government, so in some respects, we sit on the same side as the regulating community when it comes to a lot of things, but at the same time, in this environment, we're also a participant as an industry stakeholder. So we have this very unique perspective of understanding what it's like to be on both sides of the equation here, both as a regulator or as a regulated entity. And so the main thing that's important in terms of how this all fits together from a public power perspective is that we are, as the slide says, we're a division of local government, but the accountability is tied much closer to the customer than any other type of environment when you look at electric generation, transmission, distribution. So our boards are locally elected officials of cities, municipalities, local districts, to the extent that they represent more than one community. And so when there are issues that come up, the phone call goes to the people that are actually running the system and also going right directly to the council members. So one of the things that we talk about within this world, as complicated as it is, the council members that run these boards are the ones that have to describe the things that we all do in the ERO to people that really don't have an understanding of reliability, and they only care about the lights going on when they get turned on. So it's a very unique relationship. We're very proud of it. As personal note, I've been part of public power community for about 2 decades and public service for about 3 decades. It is very focused, and the mission statement is really trying to serve the public interest. Next slide, please. So just to give you some numbers and context, there's about 2,000 public power utilities across the country, serving 49 states except for Hawaii. Makes it hard to have an informational session in Hawaii when we don't have members there, but we do go to the other 49 states for various activities. Of those 2,000 entities, what's really interesting is the variation of size when you look at it. And that really is reflective of the fact that 2,000 organizations serve 15% of the market, because the investor-owned utility community serves about 2/3. But even within the 2,000 that we have, our largest member right now is dealing with wildfires in the West, in terms of LA being 1.5 million customers. We have about 600 utilities that serve less than 1,000 customers. And so you're talking about less than 500 meters in many of these utilities. So at the same time, when we deal with some of the regulatory needs and challenges associated with looking at federal rules and requirements, there's a wide variation of need that is applicable to state and municipalities. And it just makes it much more challenging in terms of how we address the things we address when we're in the trenches here within the ERO. Next slide. And this sort of gives you sort of a schematic of where some of these utilities are, and you can see the Midwest really has a large swath of municipal utilities, very, very small. As you can see, a lot of those, I think they're gray, more or less. I'll take the fifth on whether I can tell all those colors, being sort of partially colorblind, but they do reflect a lot of smaller utilities in the middle of the country, notwithstanding the fact that we are spread out across the U.S. Even in California, my home state, when you look at the amount there's about 45 to 50 municipal utilities that are actually represented there. So even though the scattergram may not look quite as dense, there's still a lot of activity associated with public power across the country. Next slide. And to provide you just with a little bit of textual context for how we look at different types of organizations. The nice thing about what we do here is that regardless of what our business model is, the objectives are fundamentally the same. We are keeping the lights on. We're trying to address customer needs. We may have different ways of getting there, but the objectives are largely the same. Business models within public power, it's not for profit, it's community owned. when we come and we talk to many of you about the various issues that concern us, it really is about making sure that every dollar is used in a way that is in the public interest. And if it is not in the public interest, it is something that we shouldn't be pursuing. The definition of public interest and what should be in the best interest of the public generally, that may be areas for debate, but largely the public dollars are what we're spending. They are not ours. And we need to be very mindful of that. In terms of governance, again, I mentioned earlier, there's elected boards as opposed to private boards, and then state regulatory commissions. We're really not that heavily involved when it comes to direct regulation by state PUCs. So when we start talking about federal and state issues, we need to make sure that there's awareness of the things that are going on in those conversations so that we can add additional context for things that are more defined by local governance. So lots of things that are tied to these types of organizations. They all work pretty well when you think about the fact that when we do have mutual aid issues, it doesn't matter what type of business model you are, we all sort of work together. So that is a model for any type of industry, and quite honestly, we should all be very proud of that. Next slide. And again, just to give you a little bit of additional context for how we sort of look at things, you look at the generating capacity, again, 2,000 utilities, many of ours are vertically integrated, and so we have our generation assets still within what we have been traditionally doing for 100 years, but at the same time, the percentage of it is not necessarily that large. So when we start to look at things related to generation, we have to kind of keep that in context for how that fits in with the various entities that are providing generation generation to the grid. Next slide. And same goes when you start to look at fuel types, and of course we're moving heavily towards a clean energy economy, and so some of the things that we're doing to change our resource mix, not really fundamentally that different in terms of the municipal discussion, the cooperative discussion, and the investor-owned utility discussion. What you may see is a slight variation in how these things are changed. And sometimes they're tied to things as simple as contractual commitments. And so in the public power world, there's public investment tied to various resources. And so the idea of stranded investment for public entities becomes a point of an important point for us to address, so that as we move from one resource to another, it may take a slightly different pathway in terms of getting there. We always talk about the transition to the clean energy economy, and when you start to look at fuel generation and policies that surround what we're using for generating electricity, sometimes there's a slight doesn't quite go in perhaps a straight line, but the general trend line is in the right direction, and we're all going there. This number, if you looked at it in 2022, would be vastly different if you look 10 years earlier, as we all know. Next slide. Regarding our public power partners, fundamental to the public power debate is APPA, is our National Trade Association. We are all very much behind the things that they provide to all of us as municipal utilities, large or small, within Washington, D.C. Of course, they've been around since 1940. And the nice thing about that is, so there's the National Trade Association that sort of is our overlay, but then we get into some variations of the theme where we support the efforts of APPA and all the partners there, but then there are certain areas where we can provide a little bit more precision to the needs of certain utilities and members within those organizations, and therein lies really the need for both LPPC, the Large Public Power Council, which looks at the largest public power systems in the state, and then TAPS, which is really focused primarily on transmission dependent utilities that are public power, but we do actually have a small list of co-ops and IOUs that are part of that membership. So when we talk about transmission dependent utilities, there's a role that they play that may not necessarily be just a public power perspective, but really sort of the relationship those utilities have to upstream utilities. And then in the context of LPPC, the larger systems have other other circumstances that are important to them. What's nice about that is that we tend to view the world relatively the same. And so when we have variances, they're really more on the mechanics of certain things as opposed to just general principles. It's really a nice organization. And I will say as a sidebar, those three organizations combined with the trade work that we do with EEI and NREC and other, I would say in the 11 years that I've been part of the NERC environment, or 15 years now, that relationship has gotten stronger over the years and really has become much more productive and very helpful for ERO activities. Okay, one more
Hey,
real
Scott.
slide. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm sorry, quick question.
Yep.
It's related to this one and the previous one. Can you talk just a couple minutes about there's kind of I was going to use the term incestuous, but that has a connotation. But there's a
Right.
interesting relationship between the public power sector and the federal, right? With preference power coming out of BPA and
Yes.
so on and so forth. So can you just talk a little bit about how that works? Because that's been an issue in some of the storm challenges that we've had.
Sure. Yeah. And probably my perspective is more from sort of on the western side of the system with the Central Valley project in California. But basically, in terms of public entities that have access to federal hydropower, and of course the tradition on that was you've got yourself a uh, a resource that's reliable and also very inexpensive. And so the notion behind public entities having access to that within our membership, as an example, every one of our members at NCPA has a certain share of the Western Area Power Administration resource that comes off the Central Valley project. And so to the extent that there are more generation that comes out of that, we're sort of a full taker of that. It does have implications for clean energy policies. We do get involved in situations where if there are recognition that it's a clean energy resource, but it's not considered a renewable resource, there might be some different policy uh, connection to that, which has to do with how we address our resource mixes. We're usually on takers of that, but it's been a great partnership that we've had over the years with the Western Area Power Administration and the West Coast, and definitely provides a significant share of generation, uh, to the west. I don't know if that answers your question, Jim, or if you're looking for something else.
No, that's it. But the one thing that has been interesting though is that because the munis have kind of contractual access to all that power, right? It's not always usable, right, in storm situations.
Yeah, well,
There was a big issue a few years ago where and earlier this year I think TVA made, and they're not a PMA but similar, right? Got the ability to do off-system sales under certain circumstances, and that was a pretty landmark change.
yeah,
Is my impression.
yeah, it's interesting too because the operation of the system, electricity is not number one on the list. This is sort of about water management and some
Right.
environmental policies and sort of water deliveries. And so we become sort of the residual off taker of what's left once that's done. And then, of course, to the extent that you have that ability to deal with that, it has an impact on how you deal with some of your contractual needs. So if you were going to fully resource and then be tied to to a federal hydro type of project, you're going to have situations where you're over and under resourced in any given year. So it just makes the challenge of dealing with resource planning a little bit more difficult. But at the same time, knowing that hydro resource is available is really a major benefit to most public entities. Thanks for that question, Jim. So one final slide, just in terms of issues and risk, and probably not surprising, and especially when we look at, I guess I'll start with the fourth bullet and work our way back. Given the size of many of our municipal utilities, the focus on distribution system, if you're a customer with 300 meters, it's great that you're connected to the bulk power system, sort of the mindset is that not much of what you do internally is going to have a real material impact. And of course, that's debatable in terms of how it feeds back into the grid. But the focus on distribution systems becomes really important for municipalities. And so trying to find that sweet spot where we definitely have a heightened interest on making sure that the bulk power system is operating effectively and efficiently and not having issues, but trying to find ways where sort of the financial administrative burdens shift their way away from what might not be as definable within the distribution system. And so this idea behind reliability objectives and affordability and how that fits in, and going back to my initial point about how city council members fit in all this, they are the ones that are going to have to describe why customers are paying for certain things. When we say, well, we're paying X amount because it's important for reliability, to the typical customer, that's a fairly abstract statement to make. And in the case of municipalities that are dealing with governance, it's very close to the customer. That becomes a conversation that's very difficult to have and subject to wide interpretation of why that's important and why that's not. We all know why that's important. Our job is to balance the conversation at home so that they understand what's happening and know that we're doing these things in the public interest. That's also why the importance of the third bullet of highest impact interventions. I know you've heard us often talk about sort of this distinction between low impact and medium and heavy impact. The low impact one, although it's loosely connected to public power and smaller entities, it sort of raises the question of there are certain things that we want to make sure that are in the best interest of the general public and also for local government that are dealing with the costs of passing those costs on to customers that may or may not know that. So this is kind of where we are with things. I know you often hear that within the conversations we have with all of you in the hallway, all of us that represent this sector. I will say that it is important that we are all remaining to be engaged in all of those conversations, regardless of what the ultimate outcome is on that. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that this sector is very much committed to the viability of the bulk power system.